Again, we're week 5 of our series we're calling Raising Home Run Kids. I hope you've had a good time during this conversation. The series honestly went way beyond just parenting, hasn't it? It's really about relationships, and a lot of these principles can be instilled in some of the most important relationships that we all have when it comes to life. We talked about week 1 that everything starts at home plate. The most important conversation right there when it comes to our children, beginning to teach them the game, because baseball and life has so many connection points, that we want our kids to run the right way around the bases, that things start at home plate, and the most important conversation to begin with is teaching children how to love God, to love Him with all that they are, love them with their whole heart, with all their soul, with all their strength. And then we went to first base, and we talked about, sorry, my mic's kind of messed up. We talked about at first base that the importance is teaching our children what it means to guard themselves. That there's this tug of war that takes place in our lives where we kind of feel this pull, this drive maybe from our selfish pride, our ego to do certain things. But as Christians, we know that there's another way in which we can live, being led by God and His Spirit. And one of the most important lessons that we can teach our kids is to learn to guard their heart and to allow the Holy Spirit to lead them. And then we talked at second base was teaching how to love others and to love others well. How do we value people the way that God values? And then last week, we talked about the importance of teaching our kids to love who they are and what they do. That God has uniquely gifted them, that there's a masterpiece, and helping that become a reality, not just now in the moment, but into their future. Now this week, I want us to have a conversation, and it's really centered around this idea that the best teams have great coaches, and the reason why they're great coaches is because they're courageous coaches. And so my challenge to all of you as adults this morning is to be a courageous coach in the life of a little one. Whether or not that be your own kids, whether or not that is your niece, your nephew, whether or not it's a child that you get to connect with over in children's ministry. Our children need people, men and women, in their lives that are courageous in the conversation. They're courageous how they engage them. They're courageous in the example that they set before them on what it means to live a godly life. Now, there's multiple layers to how life kind of works out and what the parenting thing looks like. We talked about even week 1 that there's 5 stages of parenting. We said it begins as a caregiver where our children are fully dependent on us to give them care, to keep them alive, really is what it's all about. And then you move from caregiver to cop, where you're setting the boundaries, you're setting the guardrails. Like, hey, this is the lane in which you can go. Don't go out here, or you're going to find yourself in moments of pain and greater challenge than if you just follow the road, follow the path. And then we said eventually you move from cop into coach, where the game is being played out on the field, and you're no longer out there with them, but you're coaching from the sideline, and you're hoping all the values, all the things you instilled to them in the practice time period is carrying them forward, and that they're making the right decisions the way that they engage the game. Then we say you move from coach to consultant. Hopefully we've done the other 3 stages well, and that as our kids age and they move out of the house, that when life happens and challenges become real, that they pick up the phone and they reach out and they call you and go, hey mom, hey dad, I need your advice. And you move into consultant role, and then eventually it all comes full circle that we are now a care receiver, that we're at a stage of life where we hope we loved our children well enough, we guided them well enough that now they actually desire to care for us in our older ages as well. Each layer, each stage of the parenting game, how we interact with our children requires courage. You can't be a coward and be a good parent. They just don't go together. I mean, how many of you, I'm just curious, right now in the room are parents of infants? Would you raise your hand? A few of you. So last service we had none, and it's because they were so tired they couldn't get up and come to the 9:30 service, right? I can remember bringing home Aaron, our firstborn, and just being blown away. Like, this is way harder than I ever thought it would be. And I can remember like 3 days in, picking up the phone and calling my mom going, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Like, there's no words to explain what I'm going through right now. I mean, it is not for cowards. You're not sleeping. And the moment you get them home and you have to change that first diaper at home, you can't be a coward. Like, it's tough. And then they go from that stage into toddler. And it's like, what happened to my kid? Right? Like, This isn't who I thought I brought home from the hospital. They totally changed. It's not for cowards. Then you get to elementary years. Then you get to teen years. And then you get to be an empty nester, right? How many of you are empty nesters at this point in the stage of your life? I thought I'd hear a little more excitement out of that, But you get to a point of your life, even as empty nesters, that you realize like the parenting gig doesn't stop. It just changes. And each stage of the parenting game requires courage. And so today I'm going to challenge us all when it comes to how we interact with children in our life, no matter what stage of the game we're at, that there are really 3 courageous decisions that all of us have to make as parents, as caretakers, as people that are invested in other people's lives. And it really, this is the big idea I want us to understand as we begin this conversation. The big idea is simply this. Parents that fail to lead are leading in failure. Parents that fail to lead are leading in failure. In other words, to lead your family well, to lead your children in the direction in which they need to go, to lead them in their faith, it's going to require courage. Because the world is bringing so many things at them. Through media, through friends, you name it. It's influencing in so many areas of your life that it will require courage for you to stand up and say, this is important and that is not important. To make some honest decisions for your family and for your children. I want to begin taking a look this morning at a passage in Joshua chapter 24. To give you a little context of what's taking place in this moment, you've got the nation that becomes the nation of Israel. They're the Hebrew people. They exited Egypt, where they had spent years in slavery. They're on their journey to the promised land, this place in which God had set aside so they could truly be the people that God had called them to be. The previous generation to the generation that we're seeing Joshua talk to chose to walk by fear and not by faith. And because of their decision, they ended up spending the remainder of their years in the desert overlooking the promised land that God had promised them to. And it was their children and their children's children that actually walked into the promised land. There's a unique moment that takes place. You can read about it in Deuteronomy where Moses and Joshua are addressing the people, and they're basically saying, you have a choice now. You can either repeat the mistakes of the previous generation and allow fear to overcome you, or you can walk by faith. Well, they make that decision to walk by faith. They've now crossed over the Jordan River, and they've landed in the promised land. And it's in this moment that Joshua begins to address them and really having an honest conversation about, hey, here's what you need to focus in on if you want to succeed. And he begins to address that there are times in your history it hasn't been pretty. There are times in your history in which you chose to worship other gods. You chose to worship idols. You chose to find life on your own and moved away from what God's best was for your life. We all have a choice to make when it comes to how we want to engage life and how we want to live. And that's where I want to pick up this morning in Joshua chapter 24. I'm going to start reading in verse 14. Verse 14. Am I on? Did I die? Okay, here we go. It says, now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. So again, he's addressing their history. He's saying, hey, it's time to put all those things away. Remember God for who he is. Remember, he's the one that delivered you out of slavery. He opened up the Red Sea. He allowed you to cross on dry land. He led you through the desert in a cloud of fire. Don't forget that God. Serve the Lord. Yeah, it's interesting for us. This is sometimes the difficult part, isn't it? Staying faithful to God in the moments of great blessing. Blessing can sometimes be the subtle enemy to serving God in sincerity and true love. Then we get to verse 15. And he writes, and if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. And then I love this statement Joshua makes. I mean, we've seen it in homes. We've seen it on placards. Joshua is courageously leading not only his home, but he's leading the people right now. He says, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Amen. For me and my house, I'm not going there. I'm not following the way mistakes of the past. I know who God is. I know what he has done. We will serve him. Just think about that for a moment. I mean, you imagine if you're one of Joshua's children or one of his grandkids and you're hearing him say that. I talked about week 1 that we can do all kinds of things as parents, and the reality is our children are pretty resilient. They can look past a lot of our mistakes, a lot of our sins. They are incredibly gracious in the way that they interact with us. But there's one that they have a very difficult time looking past, and it's the sin of hypocrisy. The sin of hypocrisy. They don't know how to navigate that. His children and grandchildren would have known if this was who Joshua was. Joshua stood up courageously before the people, not only the people, but his own family. He says, my home is going to serve the Lord. In other words, it's time, guys, to choose for yourself this day whom you're going to serve. Joshua commands them to make a choice. It's not a, if I will serve. We will always serve someone. And so he's saying you have a choice. You will either serve the way of the world or the king of this world, which is honestly, it's the devil, or you will serve God. It's either or. It's time to make a choice. It's not will you, you will. He's drawn a line in the sand, and he says, we're not left with an option, but me and my home, I can tell you right now who we are going to serve. Follow my example. Courageous decisions need to be made by courageous parents if you want to raise home run kids. And there are really 3 decisions that need to be made. And so the first courageous decision that a parent has to be willing to make is simply this: a willingness to guide your kid's heart. A willingness to guide your kid's heart. Proverbs 4, verse 23 talks about the heart this way. It says, keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flows the springs of life. In other words, the source of who we are, why we do what we do, it all flows out from in here, from our heart. It is not enough as a parent, it is not enough as a caretaker to just correct behavior. That's not enough. We need to focus in on what's actually going on deep down inside. What is the heart saying? Because out of the heart, behavior flows. In other words, is what he's getting at in Proverbs. Focus more on heart transformation than you ever do on behavior modification. Now, yes, there are seasons in a child's life where you need to focus on behavior modification. You do. I don't know if you've ever come across this Instagram page, but it's called Kids Getting Hurt. It's followed by millions and millions and millions of people all over the world. And it's simply these short videos of kids doing dumb things and getting hurt. There are things that happen in a child's life that you need to modify their behavior, or they will end up on that Instagram page someday, right? And we don't want that to happen. But don't neglect heart transformation because you're focused on behavior modification. And there's several things that you need to think through and truly to guide the heart well. The first thing is simply this: you got to make a plan. You got to make a plan when it comes to how do we want to guide our child's heart. And in the plan, some of the things you want to dialogue, what you want to think about are, what are the characteristics that we want our children to actually have? Who do we want them to be when they grow up? Because again, we're not raising children, we are raising future adults. And so we got to be thinking about the long term. Who do we hope they would be when they hit 20, 30, 40? It doesn't have to be written down, but it does have to be something that you take serious and are intentional. You have to come up with a strategy. Don't fly by the seat of your pants here. The Bible actually talks about that we are to train up a child in the way that they should go. Which also requires then we need to not just have a plan, but we also have to invest in their life. and invest in what really matters. Where do you want to have the most return on your investment? I hope it's their faith. How they see God, how they interact with God, how they understand God in the midst of their circumstances. How are you investing in those realities in your child's life? Are you helping God be seen in their life? Friends, the things you teach your children are the things that they will teach their children and then the generations to come beyond them. Where do you need to invest the most? Third thing is really comes about direction. It's about direction, directing your kid's heart. Because let's be honest, in most homes in our culture today, the kid has become the director. And in some instances, the kid has become the dictator. We as parents are called to be the director. The child doesn't know what they need. They don't know when they're tired. They don't know what they should eat. They don't know truly what they need. But we're called to direct our children. And what I found out is pay more attention to this fact when they're young than trying to make up for it when they get older. Whole lot easier to direct a 2-year-old than it is a 16-year-old. Again, you got to think about the stages of parenting: cop, coach, consultant. You can't play cop when they're at the consultant age. It doesn't work. And so you have to navigate, and really becomes about influence. How are you influencing your child's heart towards the things that are most important? And so as a child grows, your influence and how you influence them also has to begin to change. You got to be sensitive to who they are and where they're at. Don't push too hard if they're not ready for it. Focus on the heart more than behavior modification. And let's be honest, focusing on the heart is always more difficult. It takes more effort, it takes more work. And sometimes by default, we go to behavior modification simply because we're tired. Don't let being tired keep you from the more important conversation and investment that needs to take place in the life of your kids. Great parenting isn't about making sure your kids do the right thing when they are under your roof. It's about guiding their heart so that they do the right thing when they're out from under your roof. In other words, you can make your kids go to church while they're in your house. Or you can guide their heart to love Jesus with their whole heart for the rest of their life. The choice is yours. But the first courageous decision is we got to be willing to guide our kids' heart. The second courageous decision is simply this. It is don't carry your kids' load. Don't carry your kids' load. Galatians chapter 6, I'm going to read a couple verses from Galatians 6, verse 2. It says, "Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor. For each will have to bear his own load." When I first kind of read that, it seems like a paradox in what Paul is talking about in just those couple verses. He talks about right there, we read in verse 2, bear with one another's burdens. And then you get to into verse 5, each will have to bear his own load. Seems like a paradox. When we begin to understand actually what the original language was getting to, it helps us begin to decipher what Paul was meaning in this conversation he was having. The terms that you read there in verse 2, this idea of carrying one another's burdens, and then this idea of bearing one's own load, were actually shipping terms. Load is referring to a ship's capacity, what they can actually carry on their own from one destination to another. The burden is when a ship is actually overloaded and now in danger of sinking. Another ship, when that was happened, when a ship was burdened, another ship would then come to its aid and it'd line up side by side, and items would be carried off of the burdened ship onto the other ship offloading some of the weight on its deck and so that it was no longer in danger. What Paul is telling us is that we need to be people that carry our own load, and yet we're willing to carry each other's burdens. The principle here is every one of us has a load in which we need to carry in life. Things we have to do, responsibilities that only we can fulfill. I have my load, you have your load. I am responsible to carry my load, you are responsible to carry your load. And every now and then, one of us might get a little bit burdened. We are overloaded, and now we are in the danger zone. And in those rare instances, we need people that would come alongside of us. We need to be people that would come alongside them and help carry that weight so that it takes them out of the danger zone. But those are rare occurrences, because we're called to carry our own load. Does that kind of make sense, what he's getting at here? So how does this then work when it comes to parenting? Your children also have a load. There are things that they are responsible for. And as they age, as they mature, that load increases. The complexity of that load increases. Now, parents, if we are going to raise home run kids, we cannot carry all of our kids' load. That is their load to carry. And yes, every now and then they may get burdened. They may be overloaded. They may be headed into the danger zone. And those are the instances where it is absolutely appropriate for us to come along beside them and help carry the weight with them. But parents, it cannot be our default. And let's be honest, this doesn't happen very often in our culture today. It's become so normal for parents to just pick up and carry their kids' loads. And we understand, because we want what's best for our kids, right? The reality is that's not actually helping our kids in the long term. If we choose to do this, we are undermining their development. We're undermining their growth, their maturity, their capacity to truly become who God has wired them to be. There's this popular term that's being used over the last 5 years. It's called extended adolescence. Many of you, I'm sure you've heard of that, right? You get these pictures of what extended adolescence is. You know what extended adolescence really means? It means somebody that's the age of an adult but has the capacity of a child. We don't want any of our children to grow up and that be the way that they would be described. And so we cannot take their load. We have to allow them to grow in their responsibility. We have to allow them to grow carrying their own load. But yes, there are times they're going to be burdened. There's going to be times they're overloaded. Those are the moments that as parents, we come beside them, we walk with them, we pick up, we carry the weight with them. If we're going to raise home run kids, you've got to allow them to carry their load. It's not easy. It's going to require courage to begin to make that decision. The third decision, courageous decision that parents have to be willing to make is simply this: to release your kids from your fear. To release your kids from your fear. Proverbs chapter 28, verse 1, it says this. I'm just going to read it very quickly. It says, "The wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are bold as a lion." What is being described there is that there's two ways in which all of us can live, and specifically how we engage in fear in our lives. We have a choice. We can either lean into fear or we can lean into boldness. Two reactions to fear. There's two reactions to how we can walk through and engage the world in which we live. Meaning there are also two ways in which we can parent. You can live and parent in such a way that you are actually inviting your kids into being fearful. You're inviting your kids, when you're inviting your kids into your fears, into fear itself, you're actually putting them in a prison that doesn't have walls, but you're putting them in a prison. And that fear can overwhelm them. That fear can paralyze them. Or Or you can be a parent that parents in such a way that you teach your kids how to lean into boldness and overcome the obstacles that they're going to face in life. We parent out of fear, or we parent out of boldness. When you parent out of fear, you're working to protect your kids from the world because why? Well, the world's bad. But when we parent out of boldness, it gives us the opportunity to unleash our kids on the world to make a difference in it. We have a decision. Parents, we need to release our kids from fear and let them walk in boldness. And it's not easy. And honestly, it comes back to helping them see who God really is, how big He is, that they can trust Him because He is a God that is bigger than their circumstances. He is a God that is bigger than any fear that they will ever face. This past spring, my wife had the opportunity to help my daughter as an assistant coach to her softball team. Softball team was made up of girls from 7 to 9 years of age. You had some that had some level of experience and some that had no experience whatsoever. But the goal is let's teach them something, allow them to have fun. I had the opportunity to be at a lot of the practices and pretty much all the games. There was one girl on the team, about 9 years of age, that was absolutely petrified to walk up to home plate and try to hit the ball. I mean, the moment that she would attempt to go forward, she'd grab her bat and she'd take as many steps and as slow as she possibly could all the way to home plate. And I just watched this game after game after game. She'd get up to home plate and she'd stand there in a dress and she'd just kind of close her eyes and she'd just start bawling hysterically. The fear that she felt of getting hit by a pitch was paralyzing to her. It didn't matter what the coaches said. It didn't matter what her parents said. Her dad's like, no, you need to get in there. You need to, and we were working with her. But game after game, she just bawled. She'd get up there, and it was, you could just see the relief on her face when she'd get walked. Just, she'd just slowly walk, and she'd kind of calm herself down. The tears would simply draw back. And then there was, towards the end of the season, there was a game. She got up there and she looked and she kept her eyes open and she's crying and she's got the bat and she just did one of these. And that was about it. But she made contact. She hit the ball and she just was electric. She was ecstatic in that moment. She couldn't believe what she just did. And she went leaping, hopping, skipping all the way down to first base. And I'm like, that's not even my child. I'm standing up and I'm like, yeah! See, what we need to understand is our kids on a daily basis, they go to home plate. And if we overwhelm them with the fear of the world or our fears of the world, we paralyze them with the ability not to actually stand there and swing for the fences. In order to be a home run kid, they got to be willing to swing for the fences. And so we need to lean into understanding who God is and teach our kids from a very young age exactly what Isaiah 41:10 says. Isaiah 41:10 says this. It says, "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous hands." Nothing surprises our God. Nothing is bigger than our God. He is bigger than their circumstances. He is bigger than your circumstances. He is bigger than fear. If we want our kids to be home run kids, we've got to be willing to have the hard conversations. We've got to be willing to model what it means to walk by faith, trusting in who God is and how big God really is. How are you modeling that as an adult, as a parent, as a caretaker, as a relative? Next Sunday, we're going to have Baptism Sunday here. where people have the opportunity to come down and they're going to be baptized as a declaration that they're going public in their faith for Jesus, and they're saying, I'm on Team Jesus. Nothing magical, nothing mystical takes place in that moment, but it's just an opportunity symbolically to declare, I'm walking by faith with Jesus. And I recognize there's some of you, even as parents, you've walked with Jesus for a long time, but you've never actually gone public in your own personal faith. I can't think of a better thing to do in the life of your own kids than to set an example of what it means to not only have a faith in Jesus, but to be public in my faith with Jesus. So I would invite you to consider getting baptized next Sunday. If you have questions or you're interested in knowing more or even interested in getting baptized next Sunday, let me encourage you to do this. Following the service, walk out to our guest services table. We have people there. I'll answer your questions, help you get signed up if you're interested in doing this. But to fail in leading, whether or not it's our faith, whether or not it's in just practical life skills, to fail in leading is to lead in failure. Let's step up. Let's be courageous on how we coach those that God has placed in our lives. As I close today, I just want to take a moment and I want to pray over you as parents, as future parents. And I recognize there are some of you in the room too that maybe you've longed to be a parent and that just has not become a reality for you. I want to pray for you too. And so let's just bow. And I had asked that, if you're a child here, consider praying for your parent and pray for those that are around you. Will you join me? God, I just pray a prayer of blessing over those that are in the room today. I pray for our littlest ones that, Lord, they would come to know you at a young age, to trust you, to walk with you. God, I pray that they would grow to be parents that are courageous parents in the way that they lead their own homes. God, I pray for the parents in the room right now, no matter what stage of parenting they're in, I pray that you would help them be wise and courageous when it comes to how they engage, how they model before their children, and most importantly, how they do that with their faith. God, I pray for wisdom when it comes to how we interact with our kids, whether or not it's in a children's class, whether or not it's in the lobby, whether or not it's in our own home. That, Lord, that your love and grace would overflow through us, and as a result, draw them closer to you. In your mighty name I pray. Amen.